Disclaimer. I'm a law student, and the legal information provided is not legal advice. For that, please hire an attorney. I will say one more thing on this, because I don't want to assume as hard of a position, at least from this theoretical perspective, as opposed to like a policy perspective. I am in this weird precarious situation with how I'm going to be addressing drama, right? From sort of a practical perspective, well, I shouldn't say from a practical perspective. From a personal perspective, I don't care as much about drama, right? From a personal perspective, like it is something that doesn't interest me as much, right? Like, and I understand that like that's the thing that everyone likes to follow here on YouTube, and that's the thing which gets the views and the clicks and all that good stuff, right? Like drama makes the world go round, right? As I become larger as a creator, I have to seriously consider how I'm going to ethically respond to drama, especially if it's something which doesn't intrinsically involve me, but involves creators who I have some relation with, right? Recently, there's been a lot of criticism of people, especially people who are criticized or who are called like the Dirtbag left. And it's put me in sort of an awkward position because on one hand, I do think that the criticisms against these people are valid, at least to some extent. On the other hand, I still see these people intrinsically as people who I would probably call a friend, right? This makes me feel very similar to sort of what happened when Natalie was being canceled a little bit back further. And again, like there are entirely valid criticisms to be had of Natalie during that time, and I don't want to I don't want to take away from the validity of those criticisms, right? But when she was put into a position, or rather the people around her were put into a position where they were almost asked like, hey, do you support this? How do you feel about this? Right? And mind you, people haven't been asking me about this, but you know, I just think that like eventually it would happen. So I'm just being preemptive, right? If people start questioning me based on my associations, I think that fundamentally I want to try and operate from the perspective of, I think that these people can change if they've done, like if people have done something wrong. And again, like I am sort of operating from my own personal bias because like one of the first big, you know, shout outs or whatever that I had was when I went on the Xander Hall stream and I had a conversation with him over the course of, what was it, like an hour and a half, right? Like something crazy. And I feel like I had a meaningful impact on, you know, the way that he's done his content going forward. Again, I don't know what ableism thinks he's done. Apparently he's done other ableist things. I don't know what those are. And there are entirely valid criticisms to be had of that I can't defend whatsoever if he's done those since, right? Like I can't. But for me, I can't remember if we started the conversation here, but it's a conversation worth having. For me, I look at this from the perspective, in a very similar perspective, and maybe this will seem a little abstract, but stay with me. I see this in a very similar perspective as I see prison reform, right? People might look at me and be like, Riley, what the fuck do you mean? Like, why are you analogizing this to prison reform? Well, when we're talking about theories of punishment, we mainly have two that we work with. We have retributivism and utilitarianism, all right? And you could see those as sort of like two ends of a spectrum, right? Over here, retributivism, over here, utilitarianism. And a lot of governments, a lot of states will usually fall somewhere in the middle as far as like how they punish people. Retributivism is this idea that we should punish people according to the crime. You can see from my air quotes that I'm very skeptic on what that means. Ultimately, it's very subjective, and it's, you know, the modern version of an eye for an eye, right? If you kill someone, you get the chair, or you get life in prison. If you're a rapist, you're going to be brandished as a rapist for the rest of your life, and people are going to scold you wherever you go, and, you know, so on and so forth. And mind you, I think that some of that is probably warranted, at least according to where society is at this point. But that's to be contrasted with the other school of thought, utilitarianism. utilitarianism doesn't really care about the severity of the crime that someone commits, but more so cares about doing what is necessary to be able to rehabilitate that person and improve them so that they can start functioning in society once their punishment is over. I personally tend to fall almost exclusively into a utilitarian perspective, and for a couple reasons, right? The first is that utilitarian prison systems have been shown just to statistically be much more effective at actually accomplishing the goal of making people better for society, right? Like when we're talking about, like if you look at a lot of European countries, and I can't cite examples off the top of my head, so look them up on your fair time. I apologize. But there are a lot of European countries which have these sort of prison systems, right? And they have like some of the highest rates of success as far as like getting people who come out of those prisons to be able to succeed in society, whether it's getting a job or being able to get a higher education or what have you, right? Like they're very successful at making sure that people who come out of prisons are not just going to end up in poverty and committing more crimes. America is terrible on this front. Not only do we have very little utilitarian aspects in our prison system, we're almost exclusively retributivist in a lot of ways. We don't really do anything for our prisoners, and disproportionately, whenever people leave prisons, and a lot of people might also chalk this up to being, caused by the fact that, we have the prison industrial complex and that slavery is legal under the 13th Amendment, and that gives like a very perverse incentive to the state to be able to, to want to put as many people in the prisons as much as possible so that you can have like dirt cheap labor, right? But we do such a bad job at rehabilitating prisoners that when they come out of prison, they end up just making the same mistakes again or committing the same crimes again and then just ending up right back in prison. It's a really bad cycle to be in. And I know this because when I was working in Memphis, I worked with a lot of people who were in this kind of a position. Most people who came to us had been in prison more than once, because usually when they come out of prison, they're still going to be homeless. They're still going to have like no practicable job experience and job skills. They're probably going to go back to using because they probably, statistically speaking, were going to be drug users. And then they're going to commit a crime because they either need to survive, so they need to get money to survive, or they need their next fix, right? And then they end up in prison, and the cycle continues. If you ever want to know where most of society's problems really are, like the main ones, spend time with people who are homeless. That will give you by far the best experience with like where the real problems, the real issues in society are, by far. The reason I bring this up is because the other major consideration, and this is probably the other reason why I prefer a utilitarian mindset, is because there is a very different way of thinking, or way that you need to think about punishment when you are a state compared to an individual. If someone does you wrong, and it could be any sort of wrong, I'm just being vague here for the purposes of explanation. If someone does you any sort of wrong, then, you can take personal steps to make sure that person never interacts with you again, that you never do anything with that person again, that they are as removed from your life as humanly possible, right? Either via a restraining order, or if they do something serious and like getting them jail time. With a state can't really do that, because as long as someone's in your borders, they're going to be somewhere in your jurisdiction under your purview. And so if you have someone, then you need to be able to do something to reform that person. Or else, if you don't do anything to help that person, then really at the end of the day, you might as well just kill them, right? And a lot of people would say that's what the state does today, is that really, when we're talking about people who are subjected to like serious forms of like systemic oppression, like the people who I just described earlier, like it's not exactly living in the same sense that you or I would probably describe it, less than just being caught in a cycle. When you're a state, if you have someone who is doing something bad or something which is objectionable according to the state, then really the main options at the end of the day are to imprison that person, export that person, or to kill that person. And if you don't resolve the person, if you don't keep them from committing crimes, then really, those are the options that you're left with. This comes from the idea that, like, when you're a state, you need to remember that, like, it's not like you can just make the person go away. It's not like you can just make the person, it's not like you can just make the problem leave like you or I could with, like, an individual, right? When you have a person in your estate, you need to do something to account for them. And I see a very similar kind of thing with people who are on the left, right? I want you all to think about this. When we're talking about someone like, I don't know, Xander Hall or Vosh or someone, when we're talking about someone that we want, you know, someone who is, who does identify as a leftist, right? When we're talking about that, let's say that we as a community just completely admonished him or them or all of them. Like, let's just say that we just collectively decided, all right, this person, we don't want them to be a part of our community. We don't want them to be a part of our community. All right? That puts them in a very tough spot, because then the question becomes, well, where do they go? They're going to continue living. It's not like you can just kill them. It's not like you can just make them go away. Like, they're going to continue existing in this space, right? And so when you have someone in this sort of circumstance, I would pose to you that it's better to try and get them to reform. And I think that there's a conversation to be had about, like, what, you know, steps there are to take, like, once you've given, like, your best reasonable effort to try to get them to reform and that still hasn't worked. I feel like that's probably a valid criticism, and that's like another discussion to have, right? But my main concern is treating someone who, especially like if we're talking about Xander Hall, like someone who is like largely a kid, like what, 20 years old? I mean, like, I'm still sort of a kid, like I'm 23, right? So I mean, like, I sort of get his perspective. But the worst thing that I don't want to happen is to make him feel like he's completely alone, and to make people who are in that category of persons to feel like they're completely alone. Once you do that, people are going to start looking for other ways to be able to affirm themselves. People are going to start looking for ways to be able to validate themselves, to be able to improve themselves, or at least to be able to find communities which are going to support them. I don't think he would ever do this, or at least I'm pretty confident that he wouldn't. But I don't want to see people pull an Ariel Scarcella and leave the crazy progressive left for going to the right, right? At the end of the day, I want to try and be as welcoming and as accepting of people as I possibly can. And are there a lot of conversations about the ethics of having different kinds of creators? Yeah, of course there is. Like, I'm not taking away from those conversations at all. All right? Those are very important conversations to have. But what I want to make sure is that we are ultimately, as a community, taking a utilitarian approach rather than a retributivist one. If we take a retributivist approach, really, that's not going to result in anything constructive happening. You'll have some blood sports, you'll see some people who are really, like, destroyed by the community, and that can feel good, and it can really, you know, get some dopamine running through your head. But materially, I don't think it's going to result in that much good. From a material perspective, I think that it will result in more harm and more division in our community. And we already have a ton of that. And personally, I just want to avoid division. Maybe that's too idealistic. Maybe it is. But like I said in on my Twitter earlier, the other day, right? For people who watched and for people who voted on my poll about what kind of content I want to do over the summer, one of the options I made was mediating leftist disputes. It actually got a decent amount of votes, and I'm pretty happy about that. It means that there's a decent amount of people who are in my community who want to see this sort of stuff happen, and I'm very proud of that. I feel pretty good about my community for wanting that. Even if it's not something which turns out to be realistic, I at least want to be able to posit myself in such a position where when people are under a lot of fire from the community, that they can at least know that I will be here to listen to them. That's where I really want to posit myself. I want to, and again, like, people will interpret that as not taking sides on certain positions. People will assume that to be like non-committal. And I can entirely see why. And I just want to affirm right now that for me, I just want to make sure that everyone can feel like at the end of the day, there is at least someone they can go to be able to talk to. That's all. In the same way, I've mentioned a little bit that earlier, or I mentioned a little bit about what I'm going to be doing for work for the summer, right? And it's going to be really interesting work. I'm going to be, and I'll say it again, like, I'm going to be doing research for the Dean of Diversity and Inclusion at the law school, and I'm also going to be working for the Organized Crime Division of the Maryland Attorney General's office, which is going to be awesome. That'll be super fun. Very interesting. But a very close second thing that I wanted to do was to work for a little bit as a public defender. While I don't see being a public defender as something I would want to do long term, I see it as one of the most important things that we can do in our society. Or even when you have people who very arguably could have done something horrible, that they deserve to have someone there for them. Now, again, this is not me saying, caveat, disclaimer, this is not me saying I want to be people's lawyer, all right, in that respect at all. Like, that's not what that's saying. But I like the spirit of that sentiment, where I can at least be someone that people can go to and have someone who, cares about them and wants to talk and wants to try and resolve whatever drama is happening.